Hello BookTube, it's Leah Cooper here, and today I'm bringing you another monthly recommendations. This month I am recking mysteries. Now, most of these books will fall under the mystery genre in some way or another. These books are in no particular order. Let's get started. So the first book I want to talk about is one of the eminent classic noir mysteries, and that is The Maltese Falcon by Dashiell Hammett. Obviously there's a really famous movie based off of this book. I think it stars Humphrey Bogart, classic. And I think it's a classic for a reason. The style epitomizes the crisp, pared down 20s, 30s noir detective. And it has a range of, I think, very memorable characters and an entertaining mystery to go along with it. So it's easily consumed and easily remembered. And those are all good things. Personally, I love Dashiell Hammett's writing style in this book. I love his morally gray characters. I mean, Sam Spade is not a hero. Sam Spade's not a good guy, necessarily. And the people involved in the drama of the mystery, none of them are really villains per se. They're all just greedy people. So I think there's a surprising amount of character depth in all of his characters. Now, that being said, this book is not without its flaws. And I don't like to use the term it's a product of its time, because I don't think that we should necessarily read books in vacuums and dismiss problematic elements in historical work or text just because those elements are products of their time. I think that does nothing but perpetuate those problematic elements and create safe spaces for those problematic elements to persist in the cultural consciousness. And I don't think that is a responsible way of being a critical reader or engaging critically with a text or being a critical citizen in the 21st century. So while I do enjoy many of the elements in this book, and I do like it as a book, I have to point out that there is some anti-Italian/Mediterranean sentiment in this book. There is some homophobia. It kind of goes back to what I was saying in that Sam Spade is not the nicest person or a hero that we would want to emulate. He's simply an interesting character. And on the topic of the homophobia, I actually think it's really interesting because it's awful on the one hand, but I think it's also interesting that the book, which I want to say was published in 1919, actually had one overtly homosexual character and the implication of another homosexual character in a relationship together. I think that's just really interesting, sort of socially fascinating to look at, not necessarily as it's not good representation or anything, but merely it is representation dating back 100 years ago. And that's always intriguing to me, kind of on an academic level. The book comes with its pros and its cons. It is a classic though, and it's pretty good. Second book I want to mention, I own a copy of it. I own the entire series, but they're all in storage, so I'm not going to pull them out. And that is The Air Affair by Jasper Fforde. Now, I've only read the first two books in this series. I want to say there's 4 or 5. This book takes place in an alternative, I want to say 1984, 1985 England. I can't remember the exact date in the book, where England never finished fighting the Crimean War, and there are all these different departments in the police that are very different from what we would expect to find in the police. There's a temporal unit, people who deal with time and time travel and policing that. And our protagonist is a part of the literary crimes department in the police, and she is she has to deal with crimes against literature. And there's almost this steampunk element to it in that our protagonist, her uncle, creates a device very early on in the first book which allows him to jump inside a book and to take characters out of a book. And the first book kind of revolves around a villain kidnapping a minor character from Martin Chuzzlewit's, or maybe his name is Martin Chuzzlewit's. It's a Dickens, it's a character, it's some character from a Dickens novel that I'm not personally familiar with, and killing him. And by doing that to the character from the first edition of this book, he changes every other copy of that book. And so our detective Thursday Next is charged with figuring out what's going on and stopping this person. It's a good mystery for one thing. So it's a great little kind of quirky police procedural. But also, if you are at all a fan of like classic literary references in books and, you know, kind of a satirical take on literature and culture, it's absolutely a fantastic story. And if you at all like kind of alternative universes that aren't dystopians, I think it's absolutely fantastic. The next book I want to mention is, not strictly speaking, a mystery, but that is Radiance by Catherine Valente. And I'm putting it on this list because while it would really just be classified as a deco punk SFF novel, there is a mystery element to it that I think is absolutely fantastic and amazingly written. The entire novel really revolves around what happened to Severin Unk. That question is the root of the book, and in many ways the book is a story about her father trying to create a documentary about her life and his trying to work out how to tell that story and working through grief. But in his attempts to try to figure out how to tell that story, he has to also try to figure out what is that story. And not just what is her life, but also how did she die? What was her death? Where is she? And so every piece of the novel revolves around those questions and an investigation of those questions in very different ways. And particularly, I believe it's in the second part of the story, one of the other characters is contracted by a film studio to actually investigate, to go back and investigate what happened to her. And the entire tone of the book for the second section shifts into a beautiful noir style that's stylistically very different from the other portions of the book. And that's done on purpose because it's a reflection of her father exploring different styles of filmmaking or different styles of storytelling in which to tell her book. So the first portion of the book is more like a classically documentary style, and then the second portion is more of like, what if he told her story as a mystery novel? And so that's why the tone of the book shifts, and it shifts again in the later portions of the book. And this middle section is just so fantastic and a wonderful showcase of Catherine Valente's skills as a writer and her ability to ape so many different styles of voice authentically. There's never any moment in that second section where I don't 100% believe that she is as good as Dashiell Hammett at writing a noir fiction. It's so immersive. The entire book is a masterpiece, and I would highly recommend it. And then, of course, I couldn't make a list of favorite mystery stories without mentioning K.J. Charles. She's written several different mystery books over the course of her career, though I think recently she's been writing more just straight-up historicals. Many of her older books have mystery elements to them. Now, obviously, I could mention the Magpie Lord series, which is a series of paranormal mystery novels set in, I think it's the Victorian period. I love those, but there are actually two other books that I want to talk about that she's mentioned. They're both standalones, and they are both mystery novels. The first one is The Secret Casebook of Simon Fexemal. This is my favorite K.J. Charles novel. I absolutely adore it. This book is very much a late 19th century, early 20th century spin on Sherlock Holmes. If the central detective, Simon Fexemal, were actually an occult investigator and in love with his biographer. And so this book is written in a series of vignettes. Each vignette is its own individual case of the two men working together. It is by turns creepy and interesting and beautiful and heartbreaking, and it tore my heart out and put it back together, and I absolutely adore it. The second book from her I want to mention is another standalone, and that is Think of England. This book is a great example of kind of the classic English country house murder mystery, in the same vein as maybe like a Miss Marple mystery. It takes place sometime after the Boersmore, I want to say. I'm a little fuzzy on all my English wars. Early part of the 20th century, a retired military officer is invited out to a country home, and he decides to accept because he's retired because his military unit were given faulty guns that killed most of his men and permanently disabled him. And he's been invited out to the country home of the man who profited from the downfall of the faulty gun manufacturer. Our main character suspects that he was involved in creating those faulty weapons that got all of his men killed. And of course, when he arrives at the country home, we have a wide range of really odd, characters. We have a house full of, very suspicious people, and we have a wildly flamboyant poet who has even more to hide than our protagonist. And it's an romance set in, the early part of the 20th century. So if you would all like the kind of Agatha Christie, Miss Marple, country murder style of mysteries, you should totally check out this book. And the last thing I want to mention is probably my favorite thriller / mystery trilogy, and it is the Millennium Trilogy with Stieg Larsson. This is the second book, The Girl Who Played with Fire. The first book is The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, which obviously there have been 2 movies made out of. Both are incredibly good. If you don't know what this trilogy is about, basically we have a journalist, Mikhail Blomkvist, and a hacker / researcher named Lisbeth Salander. In the first book, Mikhail is hired by an aging industrialist named Henrik Wenger to investigate the disappearance of his granddaughter 40 years prior to the book. He believes that she was murdered and that her killer has been taunting him every year by sending him a picture of a pressed flower, just like she used to when she was still alive. Eventually, Mikhail does hire Lisbeth to help him with his investigation, and it's absolutely phenomenal. It's a piece of translated fiction. Stieg Larsson's Swedish. It takes place in Sweden. The first book is so atmospheric. It's so bitterly cold and dark and spooky. The Wenger family is a very strange and unsettling clan of people. There are so many layers and secrets. Elizabeth comes from an extremely harrowing background, and she's a ward of the state, even though she is a genius hacker researcher, and she has some extremely confrontational, brutal scenes with new caseworker who is assigned to her over the course of the book, who is a real piece of work. So these books do come with trigger warnings for sexual assault, violence, minor child abuse in this one, but Stieg Larsson writes such good characters. Like he shows so many different types of police officer, especially in this book. In this book, he really delves into the different facets of the police and the different sorts of people that you have to deal with who are police officers, some of them are good and some of them are not good, and some of them are really bad. He never shies away from showing modern day sexism and how women have to deal with it. I mean, I feel a little bit strange saying that these are amazingly feminist novels, but they are, just because of the nuances and the depth of the way he writes his characters. It feels like an exaggeration to call half the police department, for example, in this book, villains, but they are. I mean, and this book in particular revolves around sex trafficking, abuse within government systems, the mental health system, child services, the police, vice investigations, just all that sort of stuff. I cannot recommend these highly enough. I think Larsson's style is not going to be for everyone. He does have a habit of going into a fair amount of detail, but I think he just paints a really complete picture of a fairly modern Swedish life. So those are 5 recommendations for mystery novels. Let me know if you've read any of these down below, or if you're thinking about picking them up. And as always, if you enjoyed this video or any of the rest of my content, please hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you guys in my next video. Bye.